Hi, welcome to the small shed. This week on the Cyclekart I'm dealing with the electrics. See you in a minute. Now this is a relatively strange video in that it's been recorded from pretty much when I started out on the Cyclekart, and it spans that whole period of probably 18 months or more, so you'll see a lot of changes of mind and direction all the way through it. I think in that I start off with a big battery and end up with a small one and all sorts of things like that, that as you evolve over a period of time you get all these changes. So apologies if it looks a bit disjointed in places. It's because it's a single subject, but it's one that spanned pretty much the whole Cyclekart build. So let's start off right at the very beginning, when I was first looking at the cart and getting the design sorted out and buying or getting a second-hand battery to start the whole thing off. Now, while I was getting the spring, I happened to mention that I was being a lazy so-and-so, and whilst I'm trying to build this thing as light as possible, there were a couple of compromises, one of which was that the first thing I did was to order a motor with an electric start on it, which in turn means you've got to have a battery, which is weight. I'm not too worried about that, on the basis that it means I can move that weight forward and get the weight in the front end of it. And while I was talking, the guy said, well, I've got a battery as well, if it's any good to you. So I've got myself a very nice little 12 volt battery, which, if I think I'm right, bearing in mind those are the sides of the shroud of the car, the front, I think this should fit very nicely in front of my feet in the front of the car, with room to spare. So I think we've got the battery sorted, we've got a position for it sorted, and then I'll just run cabling down from the front through to the start at the back end with a key on the ignition somewhere as well. So it's time to look at the electrics on the cart. I think we're getting close now to getting a running engine now, and I really need to get that hooked up so that I can test the starter and everything else. Now, there are a couple of things that I need to do. These engines, in theory, once they're started, if you pull them on a pull handle, they don't need a battery because they generate their own electric to generate the spark. And that's fine until you actually want to stop the damn things. And at that point, what they normally do is short out the coil, I think, to the chassis, and that will stop it dead. And that is essentially how we stop them. But there is also an oil switch on the bottom of the engine, which is designed to cut the engine off if it gets tilted up and there isn't any oil present. Now, that is generally disabled on the Cyclekarts because as you're throwing the thing around a bit, the oil is likely to go swimming around from side to side, and it could well cut the power off. So that actual switch connection is probably what I'll use as effectively a kill switch, which is pretty much mandatory on these things, so that if there is a problem, you've got something which is easily visible, preferably on the dashboard, that you can just switch off and you know that you kill the engine. So that's one requirement, which will require a pair of leads, if you like, back to the engine from the dashboard and a switch. Now, I think, and that's about as far as I can get at the moment, I think that is the only place I can put the battery. Now, it may be that I don't need a battery as big as that, which would help me no end, but I did get that when I got the front axle. So I'm going to work with it at the moment. I've got the switch, one of these switches for this kill switch for the engine, that you lift the cover do it one-handed. Lift the cover, turn it on, try again. Lift the cover up, you turn it on, and that will enable you to run the engine, and then if there is a problem at all, you just slam that down, it'll immediately cut the power off, or it'll cut the engine anyway. So that will be the kill switch for the engine. We've got that. What I would also like though is a complete isolation of the battery from anywhere else, because if there is a problem at all, it's no good just killing the engine if the battery is still doing something that it shouldn't be. And to that end, I've got a battery isolation switch that you very often see on competition cars on the outside of the car, and I think that's where I'm going to mount it on the outside. One of the things I can do, and I can't remember which side it's on now, the Austin 7 twin cam racer has a peculiar starting handle position, and it comes out the side of the car on one side or the other, I can't remember which at the moment, but there is just a small hole that they put a starting handle in if they need to. And what I'm intending to do, I think, is to mount this so that that protrudes slightly through a hole in the body like that. That will look like the starting handle switch, but then when you're actually using the thing in anger, you put the key in and give it half a turn, and that will connect the battery contacts together, so you'll be running with that. So again, there'll be a perfectly visible sign for people to know what to do to kill the power as well. Now that's the starting handle hole, which incidentally on that drawing is slightly wrong. When I look at the photographs and everything I've got, it's about there actually, but as it happens, that works in well with coming in just this side of the vertical there before the carburetor. So I'm just going to knock a hole through that and then put a step drill on the inside, on the outside in, to get the right size hole. So that's got the isolator fitted now. That will be effectively mostly hidden by the exhaust pipes coming out anyway. I may have to move it so that it's at 180 degrees so that that tag sticks down. We'll worry about that in a bit. But that is in the place where the starting handle normally goes. So apart from the isolator fitting, now I'm ready to start wiring really, and the isolator will be up towards the front. So I've got to run an earth to the chassis, which will be a black wire, and then I've got to run a red wire positive through the fuse into the isolator, out of the isolator and back to the engine where it will pick up. At the moment it needs some spacers fitting in there. I've just done it on nuts at the moment. I'll go away and find some suitable 3D printed spacers, and that should give me slightly better fixing for that as well. Now the great beauty of having the 3D printer to borrow is that when I need a spacer for the Cyclekart, I can just quickly, you know, relatively quickly, an hour or so, I've got myself some spacers made that will do, custom made for what I want, and I don't have to mess around for waiting for things to be posted to me. Try as I might, I've struggled with getting this battery to fit, and it struck me that perhaps it's a bit big, and I've just checked online for a motorbike battery, which it should be plenty big enough, and it's about a quarter of the size of that one. So I think for the sake of about £20 I'm going to go for a smaller battery. That way I can solve all my problems of getting the master cylinder in, or the brake cylinder in, which wasn't fitting at all well. Right, I've just had the last delivery of what I think are the bits I need to get the electrics going. I'm not sure whether it's a joke one or not, but I've got a small battery which I'm assured will do me for this sort of use. We'll see. If not, I've got room for more than that, but actually it's ideal. If that will work, it's ideal for size, because it will go pretty much anywhere down here where I've got room. That will run immediately to the isolator, which I've got fitted, and which when it's on display rather than in use will dummy as the starting handle entry hole. But if I'm running it, it will have the key in it to clear the isolator and switch it all on. That's going to run up into a little 20 amp fuse block there. I'm not sure where to mount that yet, but that will give me power that is isolatable and fused. I've mounted the original electrics that were mounted on the engine in the little control box that you get with it into the dashboard. There's a a reset button there for some sort of problem. If you get a short, I think it will trip out there, I'm not sure. That's the start, on off, ignition and the starter. What I'm going to do is extend all of these wires and mount whatever needs mounting onto grounds and run it back to the connections on the motor. So we've now got all the bits to do the crimps and extensions and the coloured cables that I need, black and white, and the power black and ground. So I think the thing to do is to start at the front where the battery will be. I'm not entirely certain when I'm going to mount it yet, so I might leave myself a bit of slack with that and run the first cable from the battery to earth and to the isolation switch, and that's the starting point, I think. Right, that's got the earthing point in. Just as a test, I've put a continuity meter on that, and I'm just running the other wire up to touch on anywhere at the back, and we get continuity through to pretty much anywhere on the chassis. Right, so I've run all the wires I think I need to at the moment. They're dead rough at the moment because I'm just running wires, and I'll loom them up when I get the thing sort of working. But I think I'm at a stage now where I've basically just plugged the box that was in the back of the engine that I've stripped out, put it in the dashboard, and I've just wired that in direct. Once that's going, I can then put in or plug in the wires that take it through to the cockpit, but I want to cut out as many areas of doubt as I can. So I'm just going to get the kill switch and we'll see if we can make some flames. See what happens. I'm not going to run it or anything, and there's no oil in it, so it's not going to do a lot. But right, we've turned that on and nothing's gone bang. The switch is still on, the isolator, so it hasn't shorted anywhere. So we turn the ignition on and nothing will show, I don't think. And we'll turn it to start and see what happens. Oh, yep. That's all I need to know at the moment. We're on the right track. So we'll now decant this back into the cockpit, extend all the wires, and I think we're getting close to getting it started. Having got the engine to roughly work the other day, I'm now going through taking all the connections that we've got that were direct from the panel to the motor and putting in a wire that runs through to the cockpit so that we can extend them into the cockpit area. So for instance, that black and white one there, I'm just going to disconnect here from the motor, and then we'll reconnect that, put some heat shrink on it and seal it up, and then we'll have ourselves a route through to the cockpit. Didn't really want the terminals of the main isolator switch to get shorted out. If they happened to, like a spanner or anything, happened to catch against that and the earth, you'd end up with a dead short across the battery. So I've just been fiddling around with an old spray can top that I've cut out. That should just fit over there. I've just got to find a way of securing that now in some way, shape or form. I think I've just solved the way to hold that on. I've just glued a couple of magnets inside that lid, which will act on the steel nuts on here. I'm hoping that will fit on there. That's it, that will hold that on there now. It might. I think it's solid enough to stay there. So we'll just clear that up, clean the label off it and get it painted perhaps later on. Just wrapping the wiring loom where it comes from the engine now that we know it sort of works, or at least we've got the starter anyway. This is basically only wrapping the wires just to keep them tidy. It's not hiding any joints or anything, so it shouldn't be a problem. And then I'm then going to get some brackets fitted inside the cart to just carry this wire through, using a bit of Tessa tape, which is the sort of black hairy stuff you get in your modern cars. A bit better than insulating tape. It seems to bond together nicely into a finished job. I've brought it back from the loom on the back of the engine. There. That's now all connected into the loom, which is clipped back to the bulkhead to keep it clear of anything that will chafe, and then runs into the cockpit there. And then we'll run it along that bottom rail and bring it up the side to the main dashboard, which I've now fitted and got the switches and things in that I need to. And we can start and run a fuse box, which I think I'm going to put under the front bonnet area there somewhere, just to give me a bit of fusing if I need it for things like the fan and things like that. Right, that's got all the wiring now. The loom is now taped inside all the way up to the well, almost up to the dashboard. I've connected all the wiring up onto the dashboard. I've kept it very simple at the moment on the basis that I don't want to get involved putting ignition lights and kill switches on until I know the thing works and runs just as it was intended to, just by extending the wiring, if you like. The only thing I've done is I've taken the feed from, I've taken a second feed from the run that goes to the engine, and I've taken a second one up to a fuse box, and I've got a small automotive fuse to put in there, and then that will run through to the ignition switch. So that should sort all of that. I started off with a bit more complicated system in that I was running it through the kill switch, and then realised that that wasn't the way any of this works, because effectively the kill switch needs to just short out the coil to ground rather than cutting off the ignition. And this whole thing has been a bit of a nightmare in terms of understanding what's going on, really. That ignition switch is not like a normal car where you would get in and you would turn the key one turn and turn the ignition on, and then you'd run it to the start. That's not what's happening with this. All this is doing is, when it's in the off position like that, it's just grounding out the coil. And when you turn the ignition on, as you would expect it to do something, it doesn't do anything except break that joint. So there's no power running around, which is where I've been sort of looking for electricity, if you like, to connect things to, and it doesn't do anything. It doesn't turn on power, it just stops killing the run to ground. And the only power that's used is when you turn that further switch on to actually turn on the solenoid on the starter motor, and from then on it obviously itself generates its own electric to run. So I've got a problem really in that I can't provide power to anything else through that ignition switch as it stands. There are two spare contacts on the back of it which are a bit like the ones that are grounding out the coil, but they're independent of the other two. What they do is effectively make contact when the ignition is switched off. So that's not really going to be any use to me unless I put in some sort of relay to trip out and connect up power when I turn the key. So I've got to have a think about that one as to quite what I want to do. At the moment, all I've done in the fuse box is to bring 12 volts in positive and then looped 3 other connections so that all of these 3 across here are live and can just take out feeds into the dashboard if I need them. I shouldn't need a lot. There is a possibility I might want to put a horn on it, and I would like to put a fan on that switch to run, but again that's not needed at the moment. And then once it's all running, I will find out whether the other, which I think was the oil warning trip that shorts out the engine, I might well connect that through to that kill switch. But I think that's it. I think that's all I'm doing at the moment until we get the thing running. The battery is now mounted with a bolt that holds all that in tight. So until we actually run the thing now, that is all I'm doing with the electrics, and we'll worry about fripperies like timers that see how long it's been running and things like that until later on. Now I've got the small hour counter that I've got for the motor and mounted that in a piece of aluminium box section that needs just bolting to the back bulkhead. The aim of that is to give me an indication how long the engine's been running, so I can sort out to, you know, change oil and things like that at various intervals. The only problem that we've got is that there is no 12 volts at the back end of the cart other than the feed to the solenoid on the starter motor, and that is on all the while. That's on whenever I turn the main breaker on, if you like, so that won't give an indication of when the engine's running. And I've just been chatting to one of my colleagues at the Menage Heads, and I mentioned the fact that we've got a loosely between 3 and 15 volt AC feed off the charging coil, which is effectively going back to charge up the battery when the engine's running. And he has come up with a solution for me, I think, which effectively involves taking that voltage supply, which is between about 3 and 15 when the engine's running, depending on revs, rectifying it, converting it from AC to DC, and then clamping it down with a Zener diode to about 3 volts and a resistor. And that will mean that regardless of what the revs are, the engine should be giving me a signal of about 3 volts whenever it's on. And I can then put a relay on that, 3 volt relay, which will then switch the 12 volts I've got available all the time, so that the clock will switch on and off every time the engine is running and no other time. So I think that's a reasonably elegant solution, but it's not going to happen until I've got this thing up and running a bit, because it's another bit of stuff that's going to take time, and it's more important to get the thing actually running and find out what else needs doing while we're on the track. Okay, so I've tidied all the wiring up now. I've put a plug and socket in for the motor, which I did talk about. I've had several goes at getting decent plugs and sockets for this, and they all tended to look a bit weedy, so I've got some that I was using in model railway boards a while back that are 13 amp 250 volt type size, really hefty connectors on them. 3 connectors on there. I'm just wiring the positive direct to the starter, and then the others are coming in. I will do proper soldered joints on these joints to the existing motor bits, because I've had to extend the loom a bit, but I didn't think it was a particularly brave idea to solder things on with a blow lamp effectively right underneath the petrol tank. So we'll wait until we take the thing apart perhaps and get that tidied up. But at that end now, that's all sorted, and it's very much the same under the dashboard. That's all in and now mounted now, and all the wiring is now on 2 plugs and sockets under there, so I can just disconnect the plugs and sockets when I want to get the dashboard out. So that pretty much concludes the wiring. The battery's mounted, all the switches are mounted, the kill switch, the isolator. Got my fuse in the front, so I'm happy now. That's ready to go. Right, well that's it. We've got a cart now that starts and stops on the key. All the electrics, touch wood, appear to be working. I've got the tachometer going. There are a lot of add-ons to worry about in the future, but they're totally unnecessary to get it running. I want to put a timer on the motor, as I may have mentioned, and I want to get a fan, or I think I'll need a fan when we get the tail cone on, but at the moment that won't be needed. So we're going to see how it runs like this for the moment, and sort of add all the fancy bits on later. So I hope the video is of interest. Look forward to seeing you next week on the Cyclekart. We'll be doing something different. I'll see you then. Bye!